Welcome to the Rabble Report. I'm Grant.
I'm Joseph.
Today we're going to be talking about the candidacy and presidency of Jimmy Carter and how that has a lot of explanatory power today.
He kind of is the first modern president, isn't he? The main reason he's running in 1975, 1976, he's this unknown one-term governor from Georgia. And what is he running on? He's running against Washington corruption. He's running on transparency. He's running on, I will never lie to you.
The 70s culturally is defined as an era of mistrust.
The fascinating part about this, actually, is that a very majority of Americans still thought that most politicians were honest and trustworthy when Carter was elected. But you can already see the decline when you look at trust in government from the middle of the 1960s. It peaks in 1964. And it kind of goes off, it starts to run off the cliff when you look at the long term. I find that interesting, though. Like, what happens in the 60s and 70s?
You have Nixon, of course, with Watergate. You have Vietnam.
Civil rights, too. But at the same time, it is interesting that you still have that peak for the entire American public in 1964. That trust in government. It was cross-social, mostly, including white and black.
Also in the 70s, Americans are more atomized.
Starting around this period, the decline of the political parties as these sort of insular and siloed entities. The primary system emerges, and that allows for the public to decide on who is president for the first time. But this also dovetails with, we're starting to see the decline of unions and civil social organizations.
Churches, clubs, all of these things, the decline of these things as mass social organizations. And you're seeing the decline of the parties as mass social organizations.
Right. The Democratic Party was effectively leaderless after McGovern's disastrous 1972 run. But you still had party factions. And you still had candidates that didn't trust Carter because they didn't really see him as a proper liberal Democrat. He always portrayed himself as ideologically flexible or non-ideological. There's a quote of his where he says like he thinks he's above being liberal, moderate, or conservative from his gubernatorial runs. He comes into national politics, this openly religious figure. That wasn't really that wasn't as big of a thing at that point, really. And that's been talked about too. Like Carter as a evangelical, and how evangelicals trusted him, and how that kind of, that there are complications with that. Ultimately, the party had to be corralled behind Carter because the party was so weak at this point. But the Democratic voter base wanted him, even if he didn't have any solid constituency behind him. That's actually something, that's what's great about that article from 1977, I think. Jimmy Carter revealed Rockefeller Republican. Lydon here tries to sort of understand, how did this guy get to where he did? He's laying out all the facts about Carter. This guy had no constituency base in the Democratic Party. He had no support from whatever party machinery still existed by 1976. How did he get in there? Yeah, this is a great quote right here. The first crucial observation was that Jimmy Carter, altogether the smartest strategist and most compelling campaigner in a poor primary field, had no base in the Democratic Party and little prospect of getting one. He was a former right-toward governor in a labor-boss party from a state that hadn't voted Democratic for president in 16 years, a rural southern wasp in a party presidentially speaking of northern urban ethnics. And a stranger, it seemed, to the several power establishments representing Jews, the congressional barons, foreign policy types, liberals, and the rest, that even in revised manuals were supposed to count for a lot. He bragged, of course, that he was indeed an uninitiated new boy, and that his outsiderhood would attract a new and unconventional base.
This shows some of how Carter came to be, because you're seeing an erosion of the parties as distinct representatives of social blocs.
Right. And it was far less eroded then than it is now. But the erosion process was already there. The ability for the Democratic Party to glue all these interest groups together had really blown apart in the 60s.
Here's another intriguing part of this article from 77. Carter played skillfully on the eternal anti-government constituency, traditionally a Republican gambit. His more remarkable success, and his more important service to the status quo, was in dissolving latent constituencies within the Democratic fold, in blunting the initiative and fogging the vision of a vestigially working-class party. This from a man who was billed not just as a Democrat, but as something of a populist, yet saw neither villains nor victims in the society he asked to lead. According to Carter, there were no problems of economic or social justice in the land, no racism, no militarism. The job ahead was to make the government as good as the people.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, isn't it?
Basically saying, wait, this guy comes along and he's not based on being a working class party. He's running on America's good, Washington isn't. Let's make Washington good.
Right. This actually even probably gets to why there was discomfort among Democratic politicians with Carter, really. Because he wasn't running as a left liberal, really.
This continues. Long before the flowering of his symbolic style as president, Carter showed an uncanny knack for spiritualizing and bureaucratizing issues, getting away somehow without politicizing issues into anything resembling an us against them frame. Race and abortion were the best examples of the spiritualizing tack. All Carter felt he had to do on either front was to demonstrate that he himself was pure of heart. He often said that no black group had ever hassled him about his opposition to busing after he told how his own daughter Amy went on to a mostly black school at home. Jimmy was okay on race. Next question, on abortion, he so fervently elaborated his personal view that abortion is wrong that relatively few people noticed that in the way of legislation or constitutional amendments, he was proposing to do just what most of his rivals proposed. Nothing.
Yeah, that's not a normal Democrat. Yeah.
This quote, again, frames it almost as sort of a dishonest thing, but it is interesting how really it's getting at Carter being ideologically flexible and ideologically detached. His ideology or his views are detached from policy positions and things like that in a way that is actually quite Trumpy, if you think about it. This, in particular, it's been hard for people to paint Trump as a flip-flopper, even though he does say one thing one time and say another time if you're taking him hyper literally. But I think to his voters, there's an appeal in being disaligned ideologically that comes through in that.
Right, I agree. And it sort of sexualizes the whole point of, well, what is Carter's appeal other than he's pushing aside the idea that left and right are the socially relevant. Left and right meant something socially relevant through most of the 20th century, really. It was labor versus capital, right? For the most part. And the Democratic and Republican parties try to mirror this to some extent, even if it's more complicated than it is in Europe, really. The Democratic Party painted itself as a working class party. Whereas for Carter is simply, saying again, the government is bad, the people are good. He's playing on anti-politics. And somehow that managed to cut across a very broad swath of the old Democratic constituency that he could actually ram his way through a Democratic primary. What does that tell you? That he could do that.
Here in this part of the article, there was a corporate air about the campaign as a whole. To my perhaps old-fashioned eye, Carter had taken the politics out of politics. No one described the Georgia mafia around Carter better than a suddenly out-of-date Robert Kennedy Democrat, who observed that if Jimmy Carter had sat out in 1973 not to run for president, but to wage a proxy fight for control of the Anaconda Corporation, he'd have the same people with him.
Take away Jimmy Carter, and his lieutenants were men without political direction. So Carter got all these people around him that didn't really want to be in politics. That's what he's saying, too. But they wouldn't have been in politics without Jimmy.
Most of them were eager to say they had not been in politics before Jimmy and wouldn't be in politics after Jimmy.
It kind of reminds me of like how Obama had his own wrecking crew of sorts, the Obama knots. They kind of took him from the outside, or how Trump has this rotating cast of Washington D-listers that never would have been anywhere near the White House without him. Carter brought in these people that were like personally loyal to him because they thought he was a good guy and wouldn't be in politics otherwise. That's interesting. And he insulated himself with these people, and they never fully ingratiated themselves with Washington and how it worked back then. Because even though Carter could fly over the heads of the Democratic establishment into the nomination and into the presidency, he couldn't really legislate doing that. He couldn't really corral Washington as much as he might have wanted to doing that.
Still talking about the campaign here, we have, quote, first, last, and always, Jimmy Carter lacked a base in the Democratic Party. It's embarrassing now how long it took me after discovering that to realize that Carter was more than content to play it that way. I think in this moment, the author is still seeing in 1977 Jimmy Carter lacking a base in the Democratic Party as a fluke, right? The idea that a president would not have a base in the party.
Right. That's actually the future right there.
But that's the future.
What base did Trump have in the Republican Party?
Right. That's actually really a term that has changed meanings under Trump. Because the word base, when we use, Trump's base, who are they talking about?
It's an inchoate mass of people that like Trump. That's it.
And Trump's base is basically Republican voters.
Right.
It's used as a way of explaining by the few never Trumpers and old guard GOP people left in the Republican Party. Trump's base is used as this explanation for how the party got stolen away from them. But it's their voters. It's people who, there are new voters that Trump brought into the Republican Party, but there's also plenty of people who voted for Mitt Romney. There's plenty of people who voted for Obama, but there's plenty of people who voted for Mitt Romney who voted for Trump.
Right.
He took over the Republican Party. And I think the myth of Trump's base is used to paper over how much the entire party was stolen away. And if you think that there's much of a Republican Party outside of Trump voters, then ask Nikki Haley about that. Or better yet, ask Liz Cheney.
Right. I mean, it doesn't exist. I mean,
Harris tried to appeal to these never Trumper giant Republican faction supposedly waiting in the wings. It wasn't there. And in a way, that actually says something as well about the mythology of Trump's base as a term, because contemporary presidents don't really run on a base in the same way.
No, and Trump himself didn't either. He cut across all the supposed. There's something I struggled with actually when Trump was running first. I was writing an article on this for a magazine that's defunct now, but anyway, I was trying to write about factions in in American party politics, right? The reason why that article never went out is because I could never square exactly what Trump's base was, because he didn't have one.
He had taken over the party itself.
Right. And it was just, and it wasn't some faction of the party either. It isn't evangelical conservatives. It isn't, I don't know, anything else. I
don't even think it's the white working class.
No, not really. Although I do want to get to that actually, because something I find interesting in my research on Carter and Walz. The question is, in this research I was doing, it was basically, how did Carter win Walz voters over, including in the primaries? Because Walz ran against Carter in '76, for instance. So how did he do that? and how did like it actually eroded like Wallace's support among Southerners too. Primarily, white working class voters, obviously. Carter was not running a racial campaign. He couldn't if he wanted to run a national campaign. What he was doing is that he was running an anti-Washington campaign. He was running against Washington bureaucracy and how it betrayed the American people, that type of thing, making government good again. And that actually resonated with a lot of Wallace's supporters. And Carter could use that and the fact that he was the non-Wallace guy on the ballot to also win black voters. He was trying to have it both ways in some ways. He actually did use like old segregationist senators to go out and use their machinery and corral voters to vote for him. But at the same time, he would get what would exist of a black political machinery to go and turn out voters for him in his campaigns. Southern civil rights politicians and activists, especially in 1980. And of course, what he was, trying to like triangulate was doing this and making sure nobody would notice that he was playing both sides in a sense.
I'm going to quote the article again, if you don't mind. Carter secured and broadened black support by confronting George Wallace in the Florida primary. The long buildup of that rendezvous with Wallace seemed to me the definitive Carter masterstroke of daring, bluff, and ballyhoo. The black enthusiasm it generated in the South was recycled in the North as reason enough for white liberals to support Carter. What the good vibrations drowned out was that Carter had persistently bad relationships with black Democratic politicians, and he had never had anything resembling a program for Black America. In the North, the secular leaders and institutions of black political power were almost all aligned against Carter before the convention, waiting and hoping that Kennedy or Humphrey would come forward with something more substantial for black folks than Jimmy Carter's benevolent words. Jimmy Carter's capture of the black vote, attaining better than 90% of the turnout in November, seemed to me the clearest example of a process he repeated again and again. Reaching into Democratic constituencies over the heads of hapless leaders, charming goodly numbers of listeners with vague but fervent words, but escaping the crass exchange of nomination politics, never leaving any negotiable IOUs behind him. Wasn't there a pattern here? Jimmy Carter seemed better at dissolving Democratic constituencies than at energizing them. One of his distinctive skills seemed to lie in draining the self-confidence, cohesion, and hopeful assertiveness out of the various blocks that some missing leader, I kept imagining Kennedy or Humphrey, might have made into a coalition for progressive change. Now, couldn't that also be about Trump, except it's the way Trump seemed better at dissolving Republican constituencies than at energizing them. Now, of course, there was an energy to Trump's 2016 campaign, no denying that. But in the primaries, it was fascinating how these factional leaders, or these people purporting to be factional leaders, kept coming up, and Trump just kept knocking them down. And there was this idea that there were these blocks, like this conservative bloc, that Ted Cruz, as sort of the final holdout, represented, for example. But Trump beat him quite handedly.
Right.
Trump beat him.
And then Cruz comes crawling back and endorsing him late in the campaign after shrugging him off in the convention. Remember that one? In October, Cruz finally endorsed Trump. There's a great photo of him from 8 years ago, actually. Where he's phone banking.
Phone banking.
Yeah, he's phone banking voters, and he looks like he's under the gun.
So there's all of these ideas that there's still a party base.
Right.
All these constituencies, and that all these voters can be thought of in these demographic ways and via these identities.
Right.
It's even a tenuous way of thinking about the world when the parties had more mass social support. But
right, and you're seeing that decline at that point. Yeah, there's still this idea that, well, actually, these constituencies would have mobilized for some other politics. No, they weren't. We're seeing the collapse of that in earnest in the 70s. The public as siloed constituencies that the political class could like manipulate and mobilize for change, however they see it. That's starting to fall apart here.
The ability to negotiate with civil society through these various organizations is obviously going to erode if participation in those civil organizations like church, unions, etc., diminishes or starts to diminish.
And it was at that point, yeah.
And we're in a much more advanced level of that, and I think you can see reflections of it in what's going on.
But you can already see that investments in politics as a bargaining representative.
The ability of the political class to bargain with society through institutions has diminished significantly. And you can see that that's already began here in the way that Democratic Party ideologues opposed to Carter just kept hoping that someone would come out and better, quote unquote, represent the groups that Carter was speaking to directly. And he was speaking to them not as Black people or white people or what have you, but he was speaking to them as people with this burgeoning anti-political orientation. And that's why it had social cut through.
Right, exactly. That's a great way of putting it, I think, actually. And I think it speaks to how powerful this already was. Even in the 70s, there's still much more trust, and at least on paper, and these organizations still have many more people, at least on paper.
Yeah, I mean, the union movement hadn't been completely busted yet.
No, it hadn't. The numbers are still there. But was the investment still there?
That's what's interesting.
So
fast forward decades to Trump, and you have this idea among the never Trumpers that in 2016 that Ted Cruz was going to just represent the evangelical base. That's what the base of the Republican Party was supposed to be, right? That was the diehard Republicans were supposed to be the evangelicals, and they didn't go for Cruz, or there weren't enough of them, or
there weren't enough of them. Like, when you look at it, actually, it's pretty interesting. If you went to church frequently, you were more likely to support Cruz. It was less churched evangelicals that started to come over to Trump. And that actually does make sense when you think of it, really. It was Christians that were less and less invested in institutional Christianity.
Institutional Christianity, exactly, which is so parallel to what we're talking about here.
No, it absolutely is.
It's one of the signs that Trump was not going to be running purely as this far-right figure that the media painted him. And we saw that in his campaign against Clinton. He would often punch from the left as well as the right. A theme throughout this critique of Jimmy Carter as a Rockefeller Republican is that Carter is deploying this personalist style of politics that has now become old hat to us, but I think it's very shocking at the time, this personalist style of politics that you see in Reagan as well, you see in Clinton. It really, it becomes the norm in some
it does,
but it's hyper evident in Trump.
Right. It seems like an inevitable product of the decline of the parties.
You even see it with Harris. Kamala Harris is also a personalist politician when she runs for president.
Right.
It's different, though, from the personalism of Trump or Harris, because he does play on the social unity against politics well.
That's very Obama-like.
It's more Obama-like.
Right.
It's more Obama-like to play on social unity against politics, whereas Harris doesn't make the government as good as the people type of argument. She continues the siege mentality sort of thing of
incipient fascism. Yeah, of course. It's interesting because, she did employ a lot of old Obama hands in her campaign, and I think what happened, of course, is that liberals never really understood Obama's appeal, ironically enough. Even though what you're saying about Obama appealing to social unity against the government and the political class and media is hiding in plain sight in Obama's 2004 DNC speech. It's a very anti-political speech. I want to get into that actually when we do talk about Obama specifically. But you can see Carter hitting on all that right here.
There's an article in the Times from 2023 that is, in a way, a parallel of this article from 1977 that we were looking at.
Oh yeah, this horror that Carter created American political and institutional mistrust. Carter did it all on his own. He really does get blamed for everything. I kind of feel bad for Carter.
Jimmy Carter revolutionized politics. We're still paying the price.
Yeah, people have this tendency, I think, of treating presidents like they're, I don't know, these Svengali.
This article emerges out of the dysfunction from 2023 when Republicans were trying to select a new speaker. I do remember that being an interesting moment of, to this author's credit, what felt like dysfunction within the Republican Party when you had this inability to get a speaker up. This article is much more about a wider point about Jimmy Carter. It goes on to say, the paralysis this caused exacerbated long-term public distrust in government that dates to the late 1960s. Even before the House flailed for weeks, fewer than 1 in 5 Americans believed Congress could be trusted to formulate national policy or that the executive branch could execute it. This anti-politics sentiment, to a striking extent, crosses party and ideological. The article does not blame conservatives. This is actually quite perceptive. I mean, it's using this is a lot of the best articles are about anti-politics, by the way, are people complaining about it. The author is actually identifying that it isn't Republicans who created this status quo. He says, at first glance, identifying the cause of this distrust seems easy. 4 decades of steadily escalating anti-government rhetoric from a new breed of conservative Republicans. As Ronald Reagan famously declared in his inaugural address, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. And the House's intense struggle to even pass a bill to keep the government open through mid-November. This is him tying it into contemporary events. But he goes on to say that Americans haven't turned against the idea of a robust government. Rather, as much as Americans don't trust government to operate effectively, significant majorities still support government action to strengthen the economy, lower healthcare costs, protect the environment, maintain fair workplace standards, and rebuild crumbling infrastructure. Oftentimes, they're sort of calling the political class out on their bluff that there will be good governance. But I also think it's intriguing that this article starts with this anti-politics sentiment to a striking extent crosses party and ideological lines. It goes on to say, their seemingly conflicted feelings date to the 1976 presidential campaign of Jimmy Carter. His successful run for the presidency as an outsider began a trend in which lambasting government made for good politics. But as history shows us, by running against the system, politicians have undermined Americans' faith in government.
Right, and it kind of sounds like how Carter was a weird outsider figure. His religion, being from the Deep South, it allows him to cut across ideological lines and bring back the New Deal coalition voting coalition for one last ride.
And the author of this article in Time goes on to say to talk a little bit about how Carter differentiated himself from the primary field of Democrats. This involves painting himself as a moderate compared to George Wallace, but you also have such a range of party creatures opposing Carter that could theoretically be more moderate than him or more conservative on certain issues, right? It's not like Carter's running this far-right campaign.
No. But also like Henry Jackson running as a war hawk. Yeah.
But what Carter has, because of anti-politics, is, quote, thankfully for Carter, his rivals were creatures of Congress, which enabled him to shrewdly avoid having to run against them individually and ideologically. Instead, Carter could campaign against the national political system and the federal government itself, which he depicted as corrupt and inefficient. By doing so, Carter could exploit what political scientist Walter Dean Burnham termed an enormous crisis of political legitimacy that had arisen from 1960s social change, the catastrophe of Vietnam, and Watergate. As one campaign memo put it, Carter's team wanted voters to see a potential administration as a fresh start that made government responsive. Now, I think there are deeper roots to that mistrust, but it's very true. 60s social change, catastrophe of Vietnam, Watergate are huge moments in intensifying this.
The direct causes of why that temporary bubble of political trust in the post-war period could suddenly blow apart.
Inevitably, there would be governance issues, and I think the structural causes are just too strong. But these are the accelerants.
No, absolutely. I agree with that. Once Carter captured the White House with this barrage, he created a model for every presidential candidate moving forward. Right, that's true. But I guess to me, my question is, well, what if it wasn't Carter? Would nobody have done that afterwards?
This rhetoric about government inefficiency has not dented Americans' desire for government programs that would improve society. Instead, this anti-politics approach has destroyed Americans' trust in government's ability to implement the very sort of programs they continue to want. A vicious cycle has ensued. Distrust in government understandably makes politicians wary of pursuing bold, expensive new programs. Their failure to deliver, in turn, exacerbates public perceptions that both Congress and the executive branch are inefficient, and this understanding then further constrains political ambitions. So that I take huge issue with after the Biden administration, which, by the way, this was written in 2023.
Yep.
Biden spent tons of money
on
policy.
Right, and that inefficiency was pretty obvious too. And even some Democrats have noticed this. Why can't the government spend a lot of money in an efficient way? That's a complex question that we should probably cover in another episode. Maybe if you ever cover the Biden administration itself.
Years before anti-government conservatives were swept into power, Carter's rhetoric helped convince Americans who had justifiably lost confidence in Washington that restoring government required an outsider who would shake things up. Once Carter captured the White House with this barrage, he created a model for every presidential candidate moving forward. With the exception of George H.W. Bush, each president from 1980 to 2016 claimed to be an outsider to Washington politics. Even incumbent presidents often won re-election, presenting themselves as anti-Washington insurgents or their opponents as insiders. Donald Trump's exhortation to drain the swamp was only the latest use of Carter's playbook. Indeed, Carter's main pollster advised the 2016 campaign.
Pat Cattle.
So, interestingly, Cattle has been around, and he's been quite prophetic about
disaffected voters, or alienated voters, as he put it, I think.
Cattle has been quite prophetic about alienated voters. And it says here, Carter's main pollster advised the 2016 Trump campaign. Yeah, well, he advised Biden too.
He did.
Not in 2020, notably, but early Biden actually had Cattle as a advisor. They had a falling out.
Right. And that's what separated Cattle, I think, in part from Democratic politics more and more. But Cattle was the original campaign strategist and advisor that said, actually, we really need to pay attention to these non-ideological alienated voters.
This is something he really helped cultivate in Carter, that they really saw eye to eye on.
I found it interesting that Cattle was actually taken seriously in Washington in the 70s and 80s, especially by Democrats. But that also raises a question to me of, were politicians more aware of anti-politics back then than they are now? Or at least up until the recent campaign, or the recent election, I should say.
It is an interesting question. It seems like politicians, at very least, had a different response to their awareness of public hostility.
So the way Democrats, I think, especially responded to Watergate and public distrust in the mid-70s was to sort of clean house. You had a rising ascendant faction of Watergate babies, for instance. You had the Church Commission, which rooted out a lot of government excesses. I think we all know about I think that's how we know about MK Ultra, actually. It's because of the Church Committee. And of course, Carter rose up himself riding this wave and enacted sunshine laws, which I think he also did that in Georgia too. His governorship of Georgia could have provided a model for his presidency in that sense. You don't really see that in the last 10 years when it comes to how politicians have responded. I think in more recent years, you saw the siege mentality, which I find interesting, actually. And I'm not entirely sure why that's the case versus why did that happen in the 70s?
The relationship of mutual hostility has grown more hostile mutually.
Well, internally policing politics, and I think they do that, but they do it in terms of like ideology and alignment. The Leagues did on it in the 70s, but they didn't do it recently. I mean, maybe it's because they're more detached.
It's a more advanced state of political decomposition. The hostility is greater from the public. The institutional mistrust is greater from the public than it was in the 70s. The institutions for managing public trust aren't there anymore.
How do they manage this without it spiraling out of control? That requires a sort of institutional cohesion, probably, that doesn't exist anymore, and institutional self-interest that doesn't exist anymore. There are too many. There's too many wild cards and mavericks, I think. Talk about this with Andy Kim, for instance. Something like that could cause chaos right now if they wanted to. It would emerge in this very individualized way, really. Whereas I think if it became like a political mania, it would have run off the rails. This article is pretty good.
I think the ending is interesting. This attitude helps explain why Joe Biden, the first president since 1976 to embrace the identity of a Washington insider, struggles with low approval ratings despite a plethora of domestic policy achievements. Carter's success indicates that he would be better off talking less about these achievements and more about Republicans' dysfunction in the House. But doing so would perpetuate the same cycle of public distrust. It's Republicans and Democrats, and they're all dysfunctional, remarked one GOP pollster recently about the chaos in the House. For voters, it's just further evidence that Washington can't address their problems. So this article sees this all as a bad thing and something that the public needs to be sort of corrected on. But it is an interesting thing to point out that Biden is the first president since 1976 to embrace the identity of a Washington insider. That's quite intriguing. And of course, he had a historically, at least perceived as a historically weak administration.
Right. Which actually, I mean, Carter was seen as historically weak, funny enough, but as an outsider.
Yeah, that's a very interesting article.
It is. I agree.
It's been a while since I've seen one of those. We say the word anti-politics all the time, but it's actually seeing it out in the wild is still pretty rare.
No, I know, right?
The difference between our perspective and the banality of saying something like Americans like outsiders is that we can discuss the ways politics has also reasserted itself even amid this dynamic. Some outsiders are and aren't anti-politicians, right? For example, George W. Bush, who tried to really reset politics with the war on terror and to give politics a new sort of grand project and to re-anchor left and right with the war on terror. You have Bill Clinton also takes an outsider perspective, but the New Democrats are more interested in managing the situation than acting as wrecking balls, despite being outsiders. And Bill Clinton even struggled with challengers who presented themselves as more outsider than him, like Ross Perot.
Ross Perot, Jerry Brown, Paul Tsongas, even ones within the Democratic Party, or that were jockeying for the primary. Yeah, absolutely.
Clinton had a relationship to anti-politics, but it's a weaker one than a lot of the anti-politicians that we've studied.
Obviously, he played on the outsiderdom aspect, but he played on populism in a much more strong sense than anti-politics. Even as he was like repudiating the old Democratic Party and the left, I think what he was presenting himself as, or what he was presenting was a new policy and ideological battery for the Democratic Party to manage the decline that had happened. I think third wayism is kind of like the last great political class project that worked. Whereas the war on terror is the last great political class project that ended in a disaster. I think Biden was trying to create a political class project and it fizzled.
There was this supposed historic opportunity to be the next FDR, which did not materialize.
I feel like they thought they could reconstitute politics by pivoting to a lot of Trump policies without admitting that they're basically stealing his platform. So the tariff wall, for instance. Actually, it's really weird that people complain about tariffs now that, like, Trump is coming back in, given that Biden did nothing to tear down the tariff wall. He added on to it, if anything. That reindustrialization and all that other stuff that I think that basically Biden was trying to say, like, he'll do Trumpism better, but without saying that out loud.
And with social infrastructural investments.
Yeah, absolutely.
I suppose Carter has left us with this situation where being an outsider is sort of par for the course, which makes the non-one-to-one relationship between being an outsider and being an anti-politician all the more interesting. We're going to revisit Carter in the future, but what are your concluding thoughts on this discussion? I know we've run the gamut here, but I'm curious about what is your fascination with Carter as a figure?
Sort of talking about his relationship to white working class voters. It's been a big thing with Trump, right? Like discussions on that and the pathologies of the white working class, blah, blah, blah. What I find interesting, actually, is you can see as direct evidence here, really, somebody in the 70s who could campaign on a non-racial campaign against Washington corruption and being an outsider and stealing the thunder significantly from somebody who again, was a right populist on race in the 70s, Wallace. Southern politics have always had a weak social base, historically. But once Jim Crow collapses, what actually glues working class voters, white ones, to the political setup, really? Nothing. I mean, you could talk about the inchoate prejudices or desires that they have, and those certainly existed. They were certainly exploited by both parties, actually. And even Carter sent out segregationist surrogates out to, like, campaign for him as late as 1980, as I mentioned before. Obviously, we know what Reagan did. What I'm saying is that there was nothing to glue this segment of American voters really to the political setup. In a way, they were the first free-floating voters in America. Because, again, Black Southerners, they had their own organizations. But they were tightly knit for very obvious reasons in this period, because the civil rights movement just happened. But for this segment of voters, they weren't unionized mostly, white working class voters in the South. And their other ties to the political setup are really quite weak to non-existent, really. A lot of them were actually disenfranchised, too, until the poll tax got repealed.
Even during Jim Crow, social relations between Black and white people are not monolithic.
I find it interesting, really, that Carter could sexualize anti-politics in his appeals to them and wind up shipping away heavily at Wallace and rendering him almost irrelevant in the primary season.
Right. Ultimately, you're defeating somebody who is closer to segregation than you with anti-politics.
That had a lot of resonance. And I mean, you could also argue that maybe they felt defeated in terms of their prejudices, and that was in the past, and that they were sexualizing something new. Yes, but that's progressive in itself. Whatever feelings that they had or misgivings they had about integration that had increasingly become historical. You could kind of see things move on here, or other political priorities take shape, or the social priorities take shape, really, that they may have had. And ultimately, this one was anti-Washington. Of course, it's interesting that the rest of the working class in the United States had a sort of straggler effect in that sense, because they had more to tie them to the political scene. This alignment happened later, really. I mean, you saw it very much with Trump, because I guess it was often stated that Trump had a northern strategy because he basically swept the Midwest and won like large chunks of working class voters in the North. Increasingly, more of them weren't even white.
Carter, what is his relevance today?
I guess we've laid out a pretty good case of how he's the first anti-political president and how that links to Obama and Trump, ultimately. But also in a sense of how he could sort of glue what was sort of the ultimate mass political formation in American history, that old voter coalition, the New Deal coalition, together with anti-politics. And that was the only way that you could glue the New Deal coalition together for like one last ride. even in the weirdly contradictory ways that he could do it as well, like winning white Southerners with a non-racial anti-Washington appeal, but also winning the black vote in huge percentages, winning workers over, again, despite being a right-to-work Southern governor, and it all sort of cuts through by his use of anti-politics. It's very forward, actually.
What do you think of Carter after his administration?
I remember he actually offered Trump to go to North Korea for him. I think that was like towards the last time that he was like able to be a public figure, because he's been very sick since last few years. But I think that's interesting actually. He even seemed like somewhat defensive of Trump and some like media stuff I saw too. But he's kind of back and forth on that. I think one thing I find interesting about Carter actually, and I think his post presidency kind of proves the extent to which he isn't really a normal politician. He's not really part of the insider club of ex-presidents, really. He always kind of did his own thing. The fact that he criticized Israel in the way that he did in the 2000s, I remember, stirred a lot of controversy in a way that I think ex-presidents tend to avoid. As an example, he also endorsed Bernie Sanders. No, I think, yeah, did he endorse Bernie Sanders in 2016? He did, or he at least voted for him. I think that kind of shows his disalignment in some ways from the Democratic establishment going forward. It's the extent to which I think Carter has kind of avoided trying to be politically influential, really, has leaned into more humanitarian influence. But also his remaining interventions into politics haven't really been in alignment with the normal ex-president. I don't see Clinton or even Obama doing a lot of what he did, or saying a lot of what he did. He never seemed particularly close to any of the ex-presidents. I guess Ford, actually, he was decent friends with, funny enough. And maybe it's because I guess Ford was kind of chosen. It's interesting how they kind of ran against each other. We didn't even talk about Ford, but like Ford was chosen to be the successor to Nixon by Congress because he was actually seen as a very honest politician. And maybe that's why he could even run up against Carter to the extent he could, despite all the baggage that he came into 1976 with.
2019, I found an interesting article. President Trump called former President Jimmy Carter to talk about China. So these two talked about China. It sounds like it was actually a good conversation. He was doing regular Sunday school lessons at his home church in Georgia on Sunday morning. And he says that after he sent Trump a letter with some advice about managing the US-China relationship, that Trump called Carter to talk about it. And it was the first time they'd spoken. He said Trump told him that he's concerned about how China is getting ahead of us, and Carter said he agreed. And do you know why? Carter said, I normalized diplomatic relations with China in 1979. Since 1979, do you know how many times China's been at war with anybody? And we've stayed at war. Carter said that the United States is, quote, the most warlike nation in the history of the world due to a desire to impose American values on other countries. Quote, how many miles of high-speed railroad do we have in this country? We have wasted, I think, $3 trillion. China has not wasted a single penny on war, and that's why they're ahead of us in almost every way. I think the difference is if you take $3 trillion and put it in American infrastructure, you'd probably have $2 trillion left over. We'd have high-speed railroad. We'd have bridges that aren't collapsing. We'd have roads that are maintained properly. Our education system would be as good as that of, say, South Korea or Hong Kong.
That's really stinging, actually. There's a sort of outspoken bluntness to Carter that I think always was appealing to him. I think kind of speaks to how he's an anti-politician, really. I can't see. I don't know. Can you see somebody like Biden say this?
He did walk out with that 100 Years Palestine book, right?
Or was I just putting his hand by an intern? Who knows?
It is interesting. China spends a lot of money on its military. I will say to Carter, right, in a bit of a rebuttal to what Carter's saying here.
Right, sure.
China does spend a lot of money on the military.
I will say though,
more than they publicly claim to as well.
Right, sure, absolutely they do. But it is a rather stinging rebuke of like how America's handled decline, though, or geopolitical competition.
It is ultimately, it has a spiritual truth to it.
It does, and it's interesting how much this actually would sound like Trump. I could see Trump saying this.
It is. These quotes from Carter sound almost exactly like Trump. It's the forever wars. We're wasting money on the forever wars.
Right. The infrastructure stuff, I mean, I don't know I don't know if Trump really cares about high speed rail, but like, I don't think he does. But I could almost,
He was willing to do infrastructure at first, but then
everything kind of collapsed. Yeah, with that. But no, it is interesting though. The Declinist view that you wouldn't normally see bluntly from anybody from the Washington establishment, really.
it's a pretty stinging critique for Carter to be just condemning America as handling decline by going to war and being the global police and not investing in its own infrastructure.
He's doing that at 95 too, which is pretty hilarious.
He is a really interesting guy.
No, he totally is. This actually gets at why I find Carter a fascinating figure, really. But even as an ex-president, really, that's admired widely. There's something about him that can't really be quite integrated into the rest of the political sphere. There's something orthogonal about him.
So some of the things that we see in the Malaise speech that can't necessarily save him in terms of keeping him in governing power are still some of the things that eventually he does have goodwill with the American people over. He's not some figure like George W. Bush.
Actually, I wonder why because I remember there was a horrifying period where George W. Bush had like decent approval ratings again.
I imagine you'll have Democrats who don't actually approve of George W. Bush who will say that they approve of George W. Bush as a rhetorical point about Trump, which to me that means almost nothing.
Apparently, George W. Bush has a 60% approval rating now among Americans.
Yeah, because he shut up and went away.
Yeah, that's fair enough, actually.
You know what has a 60% approval rating? His paintings of his feet in the bath. Nobody wants him to be president. Nobody likes him.
That's fair enough, I think, actually. Right, like imagine if he was outspoken.
If George W. Bush was talking about politics all the time, that number would plummet right down to back down to 19% or wherever it was.
I think of Liz Cheney, for instance, or Dick Cheney. Does anybody like them anymore? Does anybody want them in power? No, absolutely not.
Exactly. W has laid low.
Right. Yeah, going away has its appeal, I guess.
The second he opened his mouth in public, that number would go down. Unless he really retriangulated things in some way that we wouldn't expect or something like that.
He's not creative enough for that.
Right.
I don't think he wants to anyway.
He's had his terms.
Yeah.
Wonder what he does all day now.
Drink, probably.
Does he drink? I thought he was sober.
I don't know. Last time I think it was at I remember something very surreal actually at Trump's first inauguration where like he was clearly plastered and hanging out with Michelle Obama. He looked really drunk though. I think he fell off the wagon.
Supposedly he became sober in 1986.
Right. I think he fell off the wagon.
It's possible. He's 78 now. He looks old too when you see him.
Oh wow. Yeah, no, he looks really old though. It's weird to think that he's younger than Biden. Bill Clinton is younger than Biden too.
Yeah, George W. Bush is younger than Biden. Cheney has voted for Harris, whereas Bush and his wife both do write-ins now. So in 2020, Bush wrote in Condoleezza Rice.
I think that might be because Dick Cheney doesn't care about social issues at all. I think he only cares about blowing things up. I do think that W is like an actual judgmental Bible thumper, ultimately. Do you think that's an act, or do you think it's kind of sincere? I think it's kind of sincere. Then again, Condoleezza Rice is a pretty moderate Republican, so I don't know. I could be wrong. Also, he's irrelevant.
It would be interesting to take a closer look at his administration. Maybe I'll come out pro George W. Bush. Yeah.
Oh God.
It was all Cheney's fault.
It is interesting that he kind of sidelined Cheney in the end.
The only thing I would say about W is he did have a good way of enticing liberals to sound pretentious without themselves realizing it.
That's true, actually.
By making little mistakes that would set off people's elitism.
Yeah, he actually was pretty good at like wrong footing liberals.
Okay. Ready for me to do this little speech?
Yep.
That concludes our conversation on Jimmy Carter. If you like what we're doing, please support us by sharing the show with someone you think would find it interesting too. If you're on YouTube, we encourage you commenting with your own views and any feedback on the show, topics you'd like to hear about. We encourage liking, subscribing. Apparently, the algorithm loves you watching another video of ours. I hope you would love that too. We're also on Spotify, and we'll soon be on Apple Music, and just exploring all the different podcast avenues. And we'd love to grow this in a community-driven way where people who listen share with us what they're interested in hearing more about. And yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So thanks again for listening.